Well, welcome back, everybody, and thanks so much. And what we get to do now is pretty exciting. We are benefiting from a panel of people who, as this is a policy conference, people who live and breathe and work policy and disability policy every day. And we are going to be able to hear from them about exactly, as we've been hearing about several issues throughout yesterday and today. And now we're going to be talking about what is happening not only currently, but also what are their visions, what are their thoughts, and what are they thinking about what is happening now and potentially in the future when it comes to our community and services for people with disabilities. Moderating this wonderful panel is a friend of mine, Fred Robinson, who is the Executive Director of the Arc of Riverside. And Fred has been a champion and an advocate for many, many years. And what we are lucky to have is the perspective that Fred will be able to bring, and then also be able to bring out of our panelists and guests that we have with us today. So will you please welcome Fred and our guest speakers.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you. It's so good to be with you today. See so many new faces, a lot of old friends. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay. We're going to talk about the Lanterman Act, and we're going to share some perspective on how it came to pass, how it served us for almost 50 years now, and some of the threats that we're currently dealing with. And then we're going to empower you to go over to the Capitol tomorrow and make sure that we get what we are rightfully due, and more importantly, that the people we support can be well served. I'm going to give you a little historical perspective. I started this work, Jordan was very nice in introducing me. It was a polite way to say I've been around a long time. And I have. I started working in this business in 1969 as a social worker at Pacific State Hospital in Pomona, California, in the Department of Mental Hygiene. We used really appropriate language back in those days. And Pacific State Hospital later was known as Lanterman Developmental Center, and thankfully it is now closed. But I was given this little booklet shortly after I went to work there, and I remember the director of the social service department said this is about a new bill that they've written up there in Sacramento called the Lanterman Act, AB 225. I still remember the number. He said, I don't think it's going to have much impact on what we do. The state hospital system is always and always will be the focal point on how we serve people with disabilities. How wrong he was, thankfully. I want to read a couple of things from this little pamphlet. The language wasn't politically correct back then, but in the preface, it says, California is preparing to implement the Lanterman Act. This progressive legislation provides us with a dynamic framework on which we shall build a comprehensive system to ensure that people with, I'm going to insert correct language, IDD, develop to the fullest extent of which they are capable. Ronald Reagan, governor. That was from our governor. And that was way back in 1969. I want to read another, and the Lanterman Act has been challenged many times. One of the first challenges came shortly after it was passed. I want to read another passage from this original bill. This is only 24 pages long. That's how comprehensive the original law was. The legislature finds that services required of a regional center are of such a special and unique nature that they cannot be satisfactorily provided by state agencies. Therefore, private nonprofit, community, local public agencies shall be utilized for the purpose of operating regional centers. That's how we got regional centers with community-based nonprofit boards. Please remember that Frank Lanterman, who wrote the original law, was a conservative Republican from Pasadena, and our governor was Ronald Reagan at that time. And there was no way Governor Reagan was going to sign a bill adding thousands of new state employees to the payroll of the state of California. That just wasn't in his nature. So we got this really great concept of community-based nonprofits, regional centers. Regional centers were designed to serve local communities. They were encouraged to be specific to their communities, and there was a lot of innovation and variety in the way regional centers developed. But there was somebody who didn't like that paragraph, and they filed a lawsuit against the state almost immediately. Anybody want to guess who that was? California State Employees Association filed a lawsuit saying, can't do that. These are public services, can only be done correctly with state employees. They lost the lawsuit. So September 4th, 1969 is when the bill was actually signed. And I was working at the Pacific State Hospital, and then I went into the community system after I went to graduate school for a couple of years, and I worked in the regional center system. In the 1970s was really a wonderful time to be in this business. It was really a period of Camelot. We were out there, we were young, we were excited, we were developing new programs, we knew that we had something special, and we wanted to make it last and make it work for people with disabilities. The challenges were to come. I'm going to fast forward a little bit to 1982. When things had been going pretty well, we had all 21 regional centers up and running. It was really a great concept, and we were implementing it well. But California in 1982 had something that it has occasionally, a recession. And there was this huge deficit that the state had to make up. And the Department of Developmental Services told us, who were working in the regional center, that we had to cut services. And they issued what is known as the 40X regulations. I remember I was a supervising counselor at the Thousand Oaks office of Tri-County's Regional Center. And the 40X regs said there was a deficit, we have to come up with a lot of money, you're going to cut services. And it said the regional center can do three things. You can ensure that a person has a place to live, either home or a care home, one-day program of transportation to get there, and make provisions to ensure basic medical care was met. And that's it. That's all you can pay for. And I remember my management team came down to Thousand Oaks. I had about 10 counselors there. We went through, they had these spreadsheets, and we went through every caseload. Speech therapy, that's out. We can't do that anymore. Respite services, no, the department says we can't do that. Behavioral services, no, not there. We didn't call IPP meetings and bring everybody in and say, we're going to re-evaluate and reposition your individual program plan. We just cut it. The Department of Developmental Services was in charge. Now, and that happened all over the state. And we had some fair hearings. There was a lot of community disruption, but we kept going. And the ARC of, actually started with the ARC of San Diego, said, I don't think that's what the Lanterman Act said. And they filed a lawsuit against the state, the Department of Developmental Services. It was later enjoined by the ARC of California. They won relief in the lower court. In the appellate court ruled in favor of the department, saying they could cut services. And it went all the way to the state Supreme Court. And in 1985, and the recession was long since over, services had pretty much been restored, and we were going very, very well again. But I want to read something that came out of that Supreme Court decision in 1985. It is through the individual program plan procedure that the right, the Lanterman Act, grants to each developmentally disabled person, and the obligation it imposes on the state are implemented. Through it, the developmentally disabled person on an individual basis receives, as an entitlement, services that enable him or her to live a more independent and productive life in the community. That was unanimously passed by the state Supreme Court in 1985. And that is the most powerful language you will ever find probably anywhere for services with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So we had this great law in 1969. We put together a community-based regional center system. We're now serving 330,000 people through our 21 regional centers. The basic premise of the Lanterman Act as an entitlement remains today. There have been many attempts to go after the Lanterman Act. We now get every year these trailer bills where they implement various provisions. But please remember that the basic power of the individual program plan, which is a legally binding contract between people with disabilities and the state of California, remains intact. Is it full entitlement? Are we enjoying all the provisions that we want? Certainly we have a much better system than we had 40, 50 years ago. But there are pressures, and today we're going to explore what some of those pressures are and how you can work with us to ensure that that promise never leaves us. So I'm going to bring up my good friend Joe Metters. Joe is with People First of California, and he and I have something in common. We both claim to be from Oklahoma, and we both have benefited as CIOs. You know what a CIO is, Joe? It's a California Improved Okie. So here's Joe Metters.
I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the Lanterman means to me. First thing first, I just want to thank each of y'all for what y'all have done for the Lanterman for the many years, and today, what y'all do for the Lanterman. Thank you very much to keep the promise. The Lanterman, I didn't know about the Lanterman at all when I first moved out to California. Didn't know much about it. As I got into California, I got to know what it meant. Because I always grew up in waiting list state. And I used this line, if I was still back in Oklahoma, I'd probably still be on the waiting list. And I said, look, I was number 96 on the waiting list to receive services. But I guess not, about 8 years ago, I started receiving the Lanterman. I got approved to receive Lanterman services. So I'm going to tell 2 stories. One, I suffered a stroke and I needed support. And so Lanterman has helped me to realize that I still have a voice, how to say what life or quiet life I want to live. Second one was about 4 years ago. I continued to serve, continue getting the services, doing good, and I live in what's called supported living with a roommate who depends on 24/7 support to live in the community. So we both do more than a roommate relationship. Now we call each other friends. So it's important to us to have that connection as friends, not just between us, but the quiet life and living in the community. And I always say when I do my customers, I'm a taxpayer and a voter. So I try to encourage my roommate to get in the advocacy movement, but it's not for everybody. So it's not for him. Well, I'll find another way to get him involved some other thing he likes. So we're both like baseball. Unfortunately, he's a Giants fan. Me, I'm a Cubs fan. So we joke about it. We started when the baseball season starts. We became, I guess, we had season tickets for the River Cats. So on Sundays, that's our time that we spend together, just catch up what's going on through the week, so we can plan our schedule ahead. Then when I'm at conferences, or if I'm out and about, or he's out and about, we call each other to check in. Like this morning, he call in and see how I was doing. He gets worried sometimes, but I'm just trying to give him some self-confidence, because I guess about 14 months ago, I broke my femur, and I got stuck back home for 4 or 5 days in the rehab room, and that was, I call the day hill. Because I was not used to being pinned in a place like this, and I wanted to get out and about. I wanted to get back to home, get back to California, where my home is. And Lanterman has given me many tools, and I hope to share with my peers what it meant to me. Because unfortunately, I get up every morning to do a lot of things, but for example, again, my roommate needs support, so he's not that lucky. He needs support to get around. So, sometimes it's a bit hard. And that's why we have to keep the promise alive and well, and help people who wants to help and accept it. And I tried to come up here, so let's look at both sides of the stories, and let's go beyond that. So my challenge to y'all, just keep fighting. There's a lot of us, keep fighting, and let's keep fighting for the next generation. Help the new generation that's coming up. The new generation don't quite understand, like I was 10 years ago when I first moved to California. I didn't quite understand. Took a while, but it was a lot of people like you helped me understand what the Lanterman really means. Thank you very much.
And now we'd like to hear from Eric Brothers, who is the director of the State Council on Development of Disability. Oh, you want to go with Elaine? Okay. Elaine Land, Government Affairs Director, CDSA, or Project Leadership Manager, Family Voices of California. And she's going to speak from her chair.
Hey.
Good morning. Family Voices of California. I'll tell you a little bit about our organization. Good morning. Can you hear me now? Family Voices of California is a statewide collaborative of family-run organizations that are working to ensure quality health care for children and youth with special health care needs and disabilities. I manage our parent advocacy training program that really works to help families move from individual to systems advocacy by providing skills, tools, and that whole engagement. I come to this work after many years of working in health policy and grassroots advocacy, organizing, and public affairs. And when my son Toby was born about 17 years ago with Down syndrome, I had absolutely no exposure to Down syndrome or anyone with a disability, which in itself is pretty tragic. But my whole point of reference was quirky on Life Goes On. Some of you will remember that show. That was it. I had nothing else. I knew what Down syndrome physically looked like. I had no concept that there were all of these related health conditions until he was pretty sick. And we spent the next 2 years in and out of the hospital with heart conditions and compromised immune system and resulting in pneumonia and all of these other things. And I guess I was well prepared to be an advocate. I had been working in health policy, and it sort of surprised and shocked all the doctors and nurses when I would ask these fairly intelligent questions about various conditions and diagnoses. That got me into a little bit of trouble because they thought I knew more than I did. I presented well, I guess. But I very quickly saw from the work that I was doing that people with disabilities in general were not included in these healthcare discussions. And so this entry into this new world allowed me the opportunity to bring our community, our issues into these discussions. And I had, of course, with no exposure to the disability world, never heard of the Lanterman Act. And I remember when Toby was still in the hospital and I had come home. It was about 4 days old, and I got a call. I was working with Mental Health America at that time, doing some work for them. Some of you may know Rusty Seelitz, who works in mental health. I got a call from him, and he said, it's going to be okay. There's this regional center system. You need to connect. It's going to be okay. And I said, oh, I'm sure we won't qualify for that. We were employed, of course. And he said, no. You don't have to qualify. It doesn't matter. And this was a whole new world that opened up to me. I called them the next day, and there we went. So since that time, I've continued to work in health policy and work very hard to more and more bring the issues that are health related of people with IDD into that work. And a couple of years ago, when I started working with Family Voices, it just sort of naturally became this perfect fit for me. And the issues that our families face are really that intersection of access and availability. So once families are finally able to get regional center services after some sort of, not all are eligible right away, and finally able to get a Medi-Cal waiver, then they can't find providers. Or then they can't find providers who actually understand disability, intellectual disability, and those health conditions, and how to even manage and deal with those issues and the things that families face. And this problem of the funding issues, that the way families are perceiving and experiencing this problem is in being able to access qualified, trained providers and services out in the community. As my son is just over 16, and we're on a bullet train. We're almost there with all sorts of changes in his life, and many of our families feel that way as years are racing by, and we see families facing issues. The families that we work with have very complex medical needs, and we see families stuck in the hospital, their children stuck in the hospital for weeks and sometimes months because the supports in the community aren't available. So they're ready to be discharged, but they can't get the supports, the staff that they may need, their families may need to help care for them, the durable medical equipment that they need, all of these things. So it's costing our system a tremendous, of course, amount of money needlessly, and also costing our families and these children developmentally, educationally, not able to participate in our communities. And so this is a huge issue for our families, and they're, of course, thinking ahead to when my child is older and needs housing and support to live independently, and all of these things that the regional center will provide when we hit that magic number, that magic age. Are they even going to be there? The way our system is now, are we even going to have funding? I thought there were no waiting lists. What's this about? We have families who are waiting lists for 6, 9, 12 months waiting for behavior services that they can't access because there aren't enough providers, because the funding isn't there, the staff aren't trained or qualified. We have families who have respite hours and can't use them because they can't find providers. So these are huge issues for our families, and we are really working in Family Voices to train families and provide opportunities for them to share their stories, to really bring these things to life so that those who don't have the exposure to our issues can understand what this means for our lives, what this means for our health system, our system of services, and for people individually, and what this means for children in terms of their ability to participate in school and in communities and stay well. Our families are dealing with life-threatening issues, and the supports that are seemingly basic will help sustain the lives of those children and allow them to move further into those activities that they want to participate in, to grow and learn and be able to participate fully in our community. So the other issues that are a challenge, and this ties into the funding, is families are in a constant cycle of denial, and many of you experience this. It's a constant, no, you need this denial, that denial, then we'll pay. And so it's, again, months sometimes before folks can access those services they need because they're waiting for one denial or another, and they're constantly having to be in this fight mode. And so that's a huge issue for folks in terms of having funding to provide access to providers, to care, to services that is high quality, that is appropriate, and that really helps folks live those productive lives. The final piece that I'll mention is care coordination and transition. Many families are coordinating, many care coordinators who are really only coordinating care in their little silo. And there's often an expectation from parents that the regional centers, their service coordinators should be coordinating all of these systems of care, which kind of makes sense, at least to have one person doing that. And of course, they're often very disappointed because that's not the case. And so they're dealing with this range of many, many services and programs and many needs and sort of coming up against barriers at all counts. And then when it comes to transitions, then there's that cliff that they oftentimes fall off of if they're not really savvy advocates and don't know how to move through systems. It becomes just a monumental situation to overcome. And so we are working to help those families that we can train out in communities by training agencies and organizations to engage with those families, to move from that individual assistance advocacy, to try and alleviate some of that situational advocacy and engage them on these issues in very active ways at the legislature, by serving on boards and committees. So creating these leaders who can participate in a sustainable way across disability, across these health conditions, to really work with all of the advocacy organizations and share those individual stories that bring these causes to life.
Thank you, Lorna. Thank you very much. And now we're going to bring up Barry Giardini, Government Affairs Director for the California Disability Services Association.
Good afternoon, good morning, still morning. Nice to see everyone, nice to see familiar faces. As Fred mentioned, I'm Barry Giardini from CDSA. I'm the Government Affairs Director, and that means I'm responsible for lobbying and public policy for a group of about 87 providers, members at this point. Some of you are in the room, so nice to see you. I'm here to just talk briefly kind of about what our priorities are this year and what we see as the number one priority for you to carry forward and hopefully incorporate into your messaging when you're doing your visits tomorrow, and kind of give you an overview of the system as we see it in the current budget landscape. We've worked consistently with members of the Lanterman Coalition, Jordan, Teresa, and others on an advocacy campaign this year built around recognizing that rates are completely inadequate, and it's having a ripple effect to lack of access to services, lack of capacity in the system, significant challenges hiring, recruiting, and retaining staff. And all of this really impacts the folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities that are in charge of support. So, as we planned our year this year, we knew that the rate study was coming. Is everyone familiar with the fact that there's a rate study going on? It's actually done at this point. The first draft has now been submitted to the legislature, and it calls for a 40.8% increase overall to funding for our system. To put that in numerical terms, basically the rate study says that we're $1.1 billion underfunded with state funds, $1.8 billion overall when you factor in the federal matching funds. So that's huge. I mean, we're talking about a significant amount of money, and the rate study is looking at this from a big picture perspective and looking at implementing reforms and kind of consolidating service codes and different things. So we know that this is a huge ask. Where we are in the state budgeting process, we've started our budget subcommittee hearings, and we have made our asks to the Assembly's budget subcommittee. And we're going to have to push really hard through June, and we're going to need everyone on board carrying a message in order to try to get some relief this year. Now, I mentioned the rate study because it's huge, and I think it's going to be incredibly consequential in the next few years as we try to implement some of these changes and push for the funding that's going to be required to give us a stable system. But we know that it's going to be it's a big bear. I mean, there's no question that this is not going to get done this year. As I mentioned, the first draft has been submitted to the legislature. There's public comment ongoing currently, and then there's going to be a final draft report that's submitted to the legislature in May. That means that between May 15th and June 15th, when the budget's finalized, they would have to do some significant regulatory, statutory, different changes to try to implement the rate study, and we know that's not going to happen. So from our perspective, we've come in and collectively come up with an ask for an 8% across the board down payment on rates. What this would mean is about a $290 million investment from the state of California to make that first down payment on funding a system adequately. So, the $290 million we're asking for would ultimately go to fund that $1.1 billion that the rate study is calling for. We don't think that there's any reasonable way for them to implement the rate study this year. So we think that we need an 8% across the board rate increase now, just to make sure that we have a system on which to build whatever comes next and whatever comes out of the rate study, whatever reforms are there. So it's really about providing that foundation, because right now we know the foundation is crumbling. We know that providers, Elaine spoke to this, but we know that wait lists are huge. 45% of respondents in a provider survey we did earlier this year indicated that there were wait lists. Another 45% said they're closing or downsizing programs. All of this impacts the people we are committed to support under the Lanterman. And this 8% this year is our best shot to try to give us some of that stability as we look towards some of these broader systems reforms. So if there's one thing I can impart to you when you go to your visits tomorrow, we've already started the conversation. We've been at this since November. Before that, I mean, it's been an ongoing campaign. So when you're meeting with legislators, this shouldn't be the first time they're hearing about it, but it should be hammered into them until they recognize that something has to be done this year. So hopefully you'll get some documentation or some talking points or anything. If you need any of that, I'd be happy to provide it. But we really need everyone to carry the message. We're going to be in a full-blown advocacy campaign this year around the 8%. We've already begun, as I mentioned, there's going to be a rally in April here at the Capitol to carry that forward. But from our perspective, that is the number one priority for providers this year and really for the system as a whole. So I'll leave it there because we're short on time, but thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you, everyone. We'll go there tomorrow and talk it up big time, and we'll continue to do that. My good friend, Dwight Hanson, who passed away a couple of years ago, was a great advocate in our field, and I remember him telling me one time, if you want to know how the legislature works, ask Rick Rollins. And if you want to know how it works politically, read Dan Walters in the Sacramento Bee. Is he still around? He's still around, so that's good. We don't have Dan, but we do have Rick Rollins here. He had a fabulous career running the California State Senate, and now he's Legislative Governmental Affairs Advisor for the Association for Regional Center Agencies. Welcome, Rick, and thanks for all your service.
Thank you so much, Fred, and welcome everyone, and thank you all for inviting me to speak today. I'd just like to take a moment to recognize Fred. It's the first time we've really had a chance to speak, and I was just so taken as a parent of a 28-year-old son who's been served in this system now since he was diagnosed with autism back at 18 months old many years ago, to express my personal appreciation to you, and I'm sure I'm speaking for everyone here in the room, for your commitment and your lifelong service to our system. Back in 1969, I was graduating from high school. Again, not knowing a thing about developmental disabilities, I did have the opportunity to go back to Washington, D.C. in 1973 and 74, fresh out of college, to work for then Congressman Jerry Walby, who ironically, as we know, was about his equal partner in creating the Lanterman Act years after he left. Before he went to Congress, I did the speech writing and all the work during the Nixon impeachment proceedings during the Watergate scandal. So little did I know, fast forward to 1990, I had a son born and diagnosed 18 months later with autism. But back to my main point here, I just wanted to take a moment to recognize you. Thank you so much for your lifelong service. I think Barry did a terrific job of outlining the issues this year that we're all facing. Having served in the Senate, as Fred mentioned, for 23 years of my career here in Sacramento, it's my 45th year in and around the Capitol. I've had the pleasure and honor of serving as the legislative advisor to ARCA now for 22 of those years. And I'd just like to give you a little perspective from my view of where we are, both as a parent and as an advocate in the system. This is a historic year for us for the Lanterman Act. It's not only truly the 50th anniversary of the creation of the Lanterman Act in 1969, but also we're at a crossroads, as we know. This year alone, we're going to be adding close to 17,000 new children to our system. 70% of those kids are kids like my son with autism. That's on average about one new child with autism every 42 minutes coming into the regional center system. The stresses on our system continue to grow. We have put forward a proposal with the Lanterman Coalition to, as Barry had mentioned, to ask for a down payment this year with the recognition that back in September we talked about the fact that it was likely that the rate study would be late, check the box, and also that it would be comprehensive, 2,100 pages of a complete rewrite, quite frankly, of how our system will move forward with funding our service providers and the services to the people that we serve. This initiative of the 8% is well thought out and has been well received on a number of different levels within the legislature, but we all know that the pedal beats the metal as we get closer to those critical days that occur in May and June. So while you folks are here, please go across the street and continue to advocate for the 8%. We have a lot of fires at our door, but I think everyone agrees that the 8% ask is the number one priority for our system this year. We cannot afford, quite frankly, to go another year without an increase for the provider community in our system. ARCA is also on a campaign to help our service coordinators in the regional center system. We are close to 700 service coordinators short in providing that critical piece of our system of coordinating services for the people that we serve. It's interesting having the experience of being sort of on both sides of the table, having worked in the legislature for a couple decades and now working outside of the legislature for a couple decades. I think I bring a perspective and the inherent in the system as well of the way to try to get to where we need to be. We have a new legislature this year. The Democrats in the legislature now not only have a 2/3 majority in both houses, but a super 2/3 majority in both houses. 16 new members, a new administration, a new governor, who, in our initial contact with him, have great hope of his understanding of the folks that we serve. But quite frankly, sitting on the other side of the table and having been in a position in the Senate to listen to requests that come in from various groups, it all comes down to competition for the dollars. We all know that many of the health and human services programs over the last 8 years during the Brown administration were not fully funded, to say the least, and we are one of many programs that need support. So I think the fact that the success that we had during the MCO campaign was based on the unbelievable support that the community showed, and getting that what turned out to be a $500 million increase into our system. We need that same kind of showing moving forward. We need people to be dedicated and not stop at your advocacy, not only here in Sacramento, but to me, it's really about the local advocacy that makes the difference. When you're a legislator here in Sacramento, you get bombarded, you can imagine, from everyone who wants to improve the roads, to improve all health and human services programs, transportation, education, all of everything that the state's involved with. And being the fifth largest economy in the world, there's a huge budget, but there's also way more demands for funding than we have money. And we also know that California is very prone to these nasty downturns in the economy. And since education and other politically popular programs such as public safety do not wreak the damage and cuts that come down, it's the health and human services programs that take a disproportionate cut of those programs. So at this moment, things are looking good with the economy. This is good news. Many of you in the room have been around long enough to have seen other studies come out immediately by a downturn in the economy. I think we have to move quickly this year and expeditiously to at least get that 8% in the system. Because I think, when you look at a 21-page report and study that literally rewrites how we do business, I don't think anyone in their right mind really thinks that that's going to happen between now and June 30th when the budget is passed. It's going to roll out. It needs to roll out. There's winners and losers in this particular study to implement this. When you think about it, would just kind of blow up our whole system in many ways. So in the meantime, we do need an influx of these extra dollars to sustain our system moving forward. And once again, thank you all for your time and for having me.
Thanks, Rick. It's nice to have you here today. And finally, we're going to bring up Aaron Carruthers, Director of State Council on Developmental Disabilities. Aaron, welcome.
Thank you, Jeff. Probably never asked me to thank you. It's good. Aaron Carruthers, Executive Director of the State Council on Developmental Disabilities. I want to thank Betsy and the board for the invitation to come back and speak again to Jordan and his excellent team for putting on another fantastic policy conference. Thank you. Just as a quick reminder, state councils exist in federal and state law. There's a council in Sacramento, in California, and one in every state and territory throughout the country. So we're part of a sister network of councils who all exist to help people with intellectual development disabilities and their family members become stronger advocates. And through that advocacy, change the system. We've had some fantastic speakers already, people with intellectual development disability, family members. We've had other advocates who focused on what's happening in California system. And I think I was asked to speak last to kind of fill in the gaps. Because your conference title, while you're all here, is about intersections. It's still up on the board there. Intersections where disability and life meet. Disability and life certainly meet within the formal service delivery system, which is through the regional centers. It certainly meets through those providers who are contracted and vended with the regional centers to provide the services. It's where it meets day to day as we're working with those vendors to get the necessary supports that we need to live our lives. But the intersections span beyond that. The intersections are in schools, they're in employment, they're in housing, they're in transportation, they're in public safety. So I think I was asked to talk about those, last to talk about those other areas outside of the rate study. Now the rate study is important. The rate study is critical. The focus and emphasis on the rate study, it's smart of ARC to put that focus there. I think you're all going to the legislature tomorrow to talk about the rate study. That's good. Please do that. Keep up the advocacy there. There's other policy changes. Again, the council exists to change the system, and there is so much change happening. It's happening at a dizzying pace. Anybody dizzy from it? Anybody just almost tired from it? Just fatigued of all the change that's happening? There's a few hands. There's honest hands. Thank you. Housing. Housing is a big area and a big focus. Every constitutional officer has stated housing as a priority for them. Every member of leadership in the legislature has introduced something. There are dozens of bills on housing that we're all sorting through, just figuring out what would they do? What do they intend to do? What do the authors want to do? How do we create it? The council released a strategic housing framework for people with intellectual development disabilities. We were in contract with the Lanterman Housing Alliance, and we are in association with ARC, with ARCA, with the Kelsey, with the Lanterman Housing Alliance, finding ways to make sure IDD is on everybody's minds. When they talk housing, they're also thinking of IDD, so we're infusing those other conversations with the needs of our community. Public safety. Anybody ever have an eruption in the house and the neighbors call the cops? That's happened to you too, huh? And you wonder, hey neighbor, you know us, you know what goes on here, you know what we're working on, why are you calling the cops? But the cops are here, they're at your door, you're managing what's going on inside your house, they may have gone out into the front yard, you're wondering what's going on with the neighbors, and you've got the cops now in your face that you have to figure out how to navigate it all. The council is, sound familiar? The councils, we work with police departments. We work with sheriff departments. We provide training. We offer every year to every single department to provide training on interactions. When you come into contact with families or people with disabilities, what do you need to know to make sure that there is a positive interaction for everybody? That situations that are not criminal in action or intent don't escalate into something, into offenses. And those that are treated as law enforcement must. We have staff who are certified to teach in the police officer training standards academies. We do the disability training that they're mandated to do, and we'll keep working on it as it relates to public safety. Other areas of intersection, employment. The state council, when we asked the public, asked the community, what is it you want the state council working on? 3,400 people responded to that question. Thank you to those in this room who responded to that question. We do it every 5 years. Number one answer was employment. That's fantastic. That's exciting. That means and reflects a different expectation about what people have for their own lives and what they have for their family members' lives. And what's happened in a few years is we haven't seen much. There's been 9 years of economic recovery since the recession, and the employment rates for people with intellectual development disabilities have remained at recession-level, flat, static rates. Something is not working in the system, that's the outcome when we as a community say, this is our number one priority. Other piece changing the system goes self-determination. Self-determination is, we're working hard on it, we're implementing it. I call it the quiet revolution. What happens when you put the authority for someone's decision-making and their dollars into their own hands? When they're able to contract directly with the people that they want to work with. What does that do for disparities, which has been such a problem plaguing our system? We've worked hard. Legislatures put $11 million each year for the past 3 years into finding ways to reduce the gaps between who lives in the community and who's served by the community. I always wonder, will self-determination have an impact on that? Will it have an impact on providers, finding providers? Not providers formally, but individuals who work with community and services they need. So those are a few of the policy areas that are changing that are outside of the rate study. Again, rate study important. We must fund the system, keep it alive, keep it going, even as we look to the future and press forward on other issues. Thank you, Brett.
Great job. Thanks so much. I want to thank our panel. Thank you guys for being here, Elaine, and Rick, and Joe. Thank you all so much. Our friends, Terry, thanks to you so much. We're getting all geared up, Jordan, to over to the Capitol tomorrow. I want to leave you with one thought, and that is 50 years ago, some very dedicated people worked very hard to give us something special here in California. If you go to most other states in the country and ask what their biggest problem is in providing services to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, pretty much they'll give a similar response. It's a waiting list, a waiting list, a waiting list. Thankfully, we don't have that in California. We do have entitlement. There's tremendous pressure on the system. But anyway, we've been given something very, very special. It's been challenged. It's survived. And I charge all of you, so many young, energetic, bright people in the audience, to take this dream and carry it forward. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, and we definitely have a few minutes for questions. I know this is if you have a question, somebody on this panel will be able to answer it. So happy to open that up for questions that may be in the audience.
Here we go. We'll start with this one. So here we are. We have the DDS. I just wanted to ask a question to all of you. You want your 8%. Can you tell me how this 8% would keep you guys going? And if you were to go to the Department of Finance right now and say, we want 8%, what would they say to you about that?
You want that one, Rick? Barry.
Yeah. Thanks, Rick. Thanks for the question, Ray. It's a good question. I mean, I think the basis for the 8%. I'm glad you asked that. Honestly, we looked at underfunding for decades, right? If you compare how well we've done in terms of rate increases, adjustments over time, compared to the cost of just the CPI costs that have gone up in California, the index, we have not in any way kept pace over the last decades. Ultimately, at making sure our system is funded. We know that the rate freezes were put into effect during the Great Recession. They have never gone away. So we have been behind the 8 ball for a very long time. So the 8% came about because we looked at what the increase in that CPI, which is just a general economic indicator for economic growth, has been in California since we got ABX 2.1 in 2016. It's gone up more than 8% in that time. So we thought 8% was a conservative ask. It doesn't even keep pace with the wage increases over the last couple of years that are over 12%. So, when we settled on the 8%, it was really a function of looking at how can we justify this to finance. We have had that meeting with finance and explained to them where it's going. The other part of your question was like, what would this do? I mean, the reality for providers is that they have been, using up reserves to pay for things, going to fundraising to pay for core operating costs instead of, fundraising for a new building, for example. They're fundraising to pay salaries to the direct service professionals. We know that we have 40% turnover or more rate for direct service professionals because we cannot pay them enough. That's our number one cost driver in our system. So that's where the 8% is going, and that's the argument that we've made to them. We actually, Jordan and the Lanterman Coalition did a lot of work on getting a DSP survey out. I mentioned this provider survey one. But the DSPs, we had 5,726 DSPs respond to that. And the reality was shocking, honestly. We're keeping people working in poverty when they're doing the important work of supporting people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So we know that the investment in our system will go directly to direct service professionals at the end of the day. And we want to make sure that they're getting fair pay so that people are getting great services. So, I mean, that's a long-winded answer.
If we pay our staff a quality staff, we hope we want to have a quality life. We don't pay them anything. We just sit at home all day. So we believe we should pay our staff a quality wage so they won't go down the street to flip burgers. And stay with us. 6 months, 9 years. We want to stay there for 5, 6, 7. Well, forever, but nothing's forever. But pay a quality pay so you can stay around and help us to have a quality life.
please provide us a report card? Because I will say, listening to the numbers yesterday, as a lifetime Californian, it is embarrassing and should be embarrassing to us all that we're sitting in the 40s and 50th in the country when we're arguing about 8% when, what do we pay, is it $1 or less per person or something? Per capita. I mean, it's radically, it's like we're embarrassingly most expensive state to live in and embarrassingly worst funding for the disability community, and then we're standing up and saying, well, we want 8%. I think it's time perhaps to be a little less reasonable.
Thank you for that.
Can the argument be made, though, to the legislators about this rate increase from the standpoint of the minimum wage is starting to go up, and it's expected to be $15 per hour by, I think, 2022, and asking for an 8% increase when we are so far behind, what's the expression, the 8 ball, it's not unreasonable, is it? Anyone? I mean, I don't think it is.
No, if anything, it's overly reasonable, I think, to his point.
Yeah.
I mean, 8% really, if you look at the wage things, and see, Kevin wants to ask a question, and he's done a tremendous amount of work on workers' compensation for DSPs and what we're competing with against market rates. It's not just the minimum wage, but the minimum wage is pushing up all other industries for the same positions that our folks could otherwise be working in. And they can leave our organizations and go across the street and work at a number of things and make $2 or $3 more per hour right now. And a lot of them are doing it, right? So it's not unreasonable. I mean, you're asking me, we're of course providing 8%. We don't think it's unreasonable, but I do think that we're getting some traction with the legislature. They're looking at reality. I think the fact that the rate study has just come out calling for $1.1 billion in state funding increase, and we're asking for $290 million roughly, it makes us look like almost a cheap date in a way, right? So yeah, I'm just going to agree with you.
As you all know, the state will reimburse for state increases in the state minimum wage and make that funding available. But the heartache tragedy for our system, of course, is when local minimum wages increase and there's no way for our providers to recoup those costs. If you're a business in a community that has local minimum wage, you have the opportunity to raise your prices and make up the difference, but our community doesn't have that. I think the legislature is beginning to understand this sort of quirk in the way that the minimum wage is implemented for our system, and I wanted to personally thank Sonia Pettit, who is here from the Legislative Analyst's Office. And Sonia, thank you so much for your work on raising this issue to a level that makes it clear to the legislature that something's got to be done to reimburse to make sure our provider community is made whole with our local minimum wage increases.
I want to echo that. I don't think we should be apologetic for what we're asking for. We live in the 5th strongest economy in the world. Our state ended last fiscal year with an $18 billion surplus. And what did we get who run day programs? We got a rate cut with full day, half day billing. With an $18 billion surplus, I have adopted a new rule as I've come out of retirement. I'm not going to be apologetic when I go to the legislature tomorrow. Are you guys going to go over there? Don't be apologetic. What we're asking for is reasonable, it's needed, and it should be something that our elected officials would be proud to get behind. So don't be apologetic, be forceful, say we're here asking for something that's reasonable. We've gone 30 years, literally 30 years, without any significant increases in funding for the services that we offer. It's a miracle that it works at all. I mean, it's only by the grace of God, and there's so many wonderful young people that will step forward and do this work for $12 an hour. It's a miracle that it works at all. It's time the state stepped up and honor their responsibility that was given to us 50 years ago.
This is coming around.
With that, Jordan, I'm going to give it back to you.
All right, last question, one more.
So Kevin from Monos, I always love the report from the Policy Institute yesterday because he's so smart, and I really like the 10 priorities that he laid out, articulating what he thought the governor's priorities were. And I was distressed because as I listened through 1, 2, 3 to 10, I was saying, where does disability services fit in any of those 10 priorities? And I couldn't figure that out. So panel, please help me out here. I would have loved to, Kevin, but I was not here yesterday. That's an easy out.
I'll just say, I wasn't here either, I didn't see the priorities. But I do think that you're right, that we're competing with a lot of other needs and a lot of other asks and a lot of other wants. And the question is always, how do you elevate and make sure that we are at the top of mind? I think it's a tremendous coup that Ann O'Leary will be over here speaking to us at 12:30. We're going to be able to hear from the Chief of Staff of Governor Newsom and see what she has to say now that the rate studies come out. I don't know how in-depth she's going to get. But that's the kind of engagement we need to get with the people in the administration to make sure that we claw our way up that list. Whether we're on that list or not now, I mean, by the end of May, going into June, we have to be on that list.
On second thought, I do have a comment. That's a great question to ask her.
I thought the last question, I have to make sure Dwight has a chance as well.
Well, I find it interesting there was a comment about minimum wage affecting people. What I find interesting is the state law says that exempt employees must earn at least twice minimum wage, and yet when the state raised the minimum wage, yes, they adjusted fares or monies to us for the $12 per hour people. What about the 24-hour for people that were required by law? And nothing, we had nothing to cover that.
Minimum wage question is such an interesting one as it impacts this rate study, because the rate study is supposed to do three things by statute. It's supposed to lead to a system that's sustainable. It's supposed to lead to a system that is a quality system, and the rate study itself is supposed to be transparent. So the council's been looking at it through those three lenses, and the question about sustainability really comes down to this minimum wage question. Okay, you have a rate system, and you factored in what is minimum wage today, what will it be tomorrow, how do we tier the different classifications of providers so they're staying just ahead of minimum wage? But they didn't roll the study out until the minimum wage hits 2015, even though we know it will be. So the question is, did they really produce a rate study that's sustainable even at the dollars they've named?
Can we please give a big hand to Fred, Rick, Well,